When Saint-Gobain briefed us on starting an architecture awards here in Southern Africa and extending it to Africa, the brief was very clear. We want an architecture awards designed by architects for architects, and we as the sponsor are the enablers. We've considered and continued that into the 2017 awards, and we've been really privileged to have a diverse group of highly esteemed professionals join us at the table for 2 days and to give up a valuable time out of their practices and their home lives to come and join us around the table to discuss what are the issues around Africa architecture. And for 48 hours I was inspired by people tackling really difficult questions. What is our identity? How are we different from European architecture awards or North American awards? How can we be sure to recognize that it takes a level of grit and determination to practice in Africa that one may not have to engage in other countries? But how do we still keep the benchmark high? How do we promote a platform of excellence so that we create a legacy that others will follow as we build the future of Africa?
And to a long and broad discussion that encompassed architecture, urbanism, an award, a partnership, a potential collaboration, and the opportunity to be an integral part of building an architectural culture that is Pan-African in its scope and ambition, but one that looks firmly towards the future, finding new means to tell an innovative, responsive, and responsible narrative about what it means to be African, modern, forward-looking, inventive, but also proud of our past, of our multiple heritages, cultures, and contexts, and how these things coming together are shaping a new Africa.
The way it's starting, bringing together for 3 days architects practicing different parts of Africa to actually generate this pool of ideas is already something different, I believe, from how other awards are done. I mean, it's already a very innovative way of doing things, and I believe it's a very right way of doing it.
And this is a really unusual partnership. I mean, there are well-known architectural awards, the Pritzker, the RIBA, the Sterling Prize, etc., which are often underwritten by a firm or company. But I think this is possibly the first time that a global company, Saint-Gobain, has partnered with a group of interested participants. And we're all here in our own right as individuals, not representing anything. We're just simply passionate about our field, our educational systems, and our practices and cities. But this is also about growth, about building something that's lasting, meaningful, critical, and creative. And we felt that the term social gain wasn't broad enough to actually or accurately convey the sense of expounding boundaries and fields that are occurring across Africa. Socially responsive design should be the basis of all design and not a specific category that's applicable only to Africa. We are all more connected than we could possibly have imagined 20 years ago. And we're trying to find new words and concepts to describe the kinds of spaces that are both real and virtual that we inhabit literally today. So rather than think of a single category for the award, we decided to think about it in terms of values or approaches. And we've identified 3 broad themes that we think an award should look at. Innovation, looking at how necessity demands innovation, but also how innovation drives ambition. Identity, looking at heritage, history, and tradition. And implementation, which is looking critically at practice and process, recognizing that African architects often practice in unusual or unconventional ways, and realizing that these new innovative practices and processes may ultimately lead to new ways of training architects and to the broadening of the terms and conditions of architectural practice.
And in order to do good work, you kind of have to take the extra mile to do it, but in the end there's no reward for it. And I think a prize like this would encourage people that are trying to do good work and kind of showcase their work and also build a culture of doing good work.
Recognizing people that they might not be locally well-known or recognized, and will give them the power to be understood by other players, and maybe to give them the chance to actually explore by experimenting with new ways of doing things that, in my perspective, is the only way that we can achieve that finding the African way or the regional way of doing things.
The kind of values, or one of the desires we have, was to talk about heritage quite strongly. Because through heritage you are grounded in space and time. It's something that you can't run away from. So we felt that the idea around heritage would be very important. And exactly what the source of inspiration is.
You actually see common trends, especially the fact that being an architect on the continent requires other skills than the technical ones. So you realize when you start practicing that what you've learned in school has to stay in the back of your mind, and you have to find a new way to approach the market, to approach society, the environment, politics, in order to be able to make your architecture. Otherwise, you tend to disappear, and your added value as an architect becomes invisible.
Some samples that I know, is unique of Africa. Nothing very different from other parts of the world. So I think it is very important to recognize it and for the participants to explain it when it's worth.
If you have done a project in which the process of procuring the building, how it's made, how it's financed, how it's brought together, is a really interesting narrative, imagine the ways that you could choose to submit that as an entry. So rather than a jury panel sitting with 17 sections at 1 to 200 and a master plan, we actually got a document or a film or a story or a narrative or whatever. And so I think we're trying to be as broad-minded as possible in the way in which we communicate how the built environment is made here. And it comes back to that question of the brief. If we're clear about what we reward, what we recognize, I think it will also encourage people to submit projects in different ways.
There are other ways of communicating architecture that can be more effective with the public that are not directly involved.
And how many people are actually downloading and watching the video. So I think this is the start. I think the language will be defined, the parameters will be defined, not only by this team, but this team will decide on the judges that go forward. But we mustn't negate that these things do seed and they do travel very fast. And in Africa, video or film or digital, whichever word we choose, is growing rapidly.
I think the challenge now is to find ways, and there's so many different, whether you're practicing West Africa, East Africa, South Africa, North Africa, but find ways to make the architect's voice heard and show the added value of the architect.
A lot of governments, peoples in Africa, we tend to think of architecture as building or construction rather than as a cultural practice. So I think things like awards are important to bring architecture into the realm of culture and not necessarily into the realm of engineering or construction.
We've identified 4 broad categories of entry: built projects, unbuilt projects or speculative projects, emerging voices or a student category, and critical dialogues, which would involve writing, filmmaking, photography, work that recognizes and rewards a broader analysis of our built environment fields.
I think that category about dialogue or voices is very important, and it might actually supersede some of the other categories in expanding the limit of the idea of what architecture is, so that we expand it beyond just looking at buildings, but we talk more about spatial practice.
We felt that this should really be about this continent, that work that is made physically here. So we are not limiting who might enter, but one of the contexts or one of the primary conditions that it must be located somewhere on this continent. And even if work is, particularly in kind of the student or the emerging voices or the unbuilt speculative categories, so long as that work has something to do with this continent, we feel that it should be included. And it is partly about not just what we feel about ourselves, but also what we say to the rest of the world. And I think in this day and age, we can't ignore that there is a global conversation. But rather than mimic and imitate and cut and paste what's going on elsewhere, this is an attempt to generate ideas in a context that's really physically located here, and to find ways to celebrate the complexity and the challenges, not in a glib way, but also not to be defined entirely by the problems.
Imagine you've got one entry from every country, for example. You could never force that to happen, but that would be a wonderful thing.
I think this is why we're trying to have a very open platform, so that everybody who feels that they have something to bring as far as an answer to those questions would have a valid entry. And the fact that it will be judged pretty much with an open mindset, can allow new voices to emerge.
The relationship between the jury and the steering committee, I think, is a really important one. Like, none of us will be judges. We, in a sense, our task for the next 2 years is to write the brief. The judges will be awarded, and we will take them from as wide a selection as possible. And then that judging panel will eventually become the steering committee for the next round of awards. So this is conceived of at the moment as a biannual award. And there is always a relationship between the steering committee and how it sets out the brief. But that relationship is fluid. It changes. One of the things we're really keen to do, I think you used the right word, is to build a community of like-minded people across the continent who are interested, not necessarily in doing the same things, but in having a platform to share what one another is doing. And I mean, it's a sad truth that in this kind of age of interconnectedness, actually face-to-face encounters are still the most important and valuable exercise. Somebody told me, and you'll have to tell me if this is true, that the word in Zulu for an architect is a magician of space.
Inventor of space.
Or an inventor of space. And I think that's such a phenomenal idea. And I think in a way, we've been saying it all along, we would like to make the space to think about these things and think about them critically and creatively.